One of the great things about the LSB is it's built off the New American Standard Bible. The scholars that worked on the NASB, they did an excellent job. So you're working off a really great foundation.
What makes the LSB the LSB?
Pastor John had this concern with a lot of modern English translations moving away or focusing more on the reader, if you will, instead of focusing on the author of Scripture. And so, he had concern that the NAS or the NASB would kind of move in that same direction. So he wanted to see if Lockman would be willing to allow an update that they could help, in terms of improve and make the translation decisions that they thought were important. And so, one of the great things about the LSB is it's built off the New American Standard Bible, the 95 edition. So the blessing behind that is the scholars that worked on the NASB, they did an excellent job. So you're working off a really great foundation. What the LSB did was make some refinements, some improvements, which I think are very useful and very helpful. Growing up at Grace Church, I grew up on the NASB, so very familiar with it. And, one of the interesting things is, you memorize verses, right, growing up, whether it's through Awana or other programs. So honestly, there was some uncomfortableness in, seeing switches, right? You almost feel like they're changing these precious words. But one of the things that I really, really appreciate about Abner and all the translators, but Abner specifically, is we were going through the Gospels together. Chris Scotty is our VP and publisher, myself and Abner, and we're walking through this. And I can't remember the verse. It was probably one of these old Awana verses that it really troubled me that they were changing that verse. And so I remember in a conversation bringing up with Abner, I'm like, Abner, this is a very well-known verse. So many kids, so many people have memorized this. Do you realize what we're doing by changing it? And this story will probably just show how bright Abner is. So Abner basically said, well, look, let me kind of just explain why we have to make these changes. And he patiently walked through and explained in the Greek why it had to be changed this way, which would be better. But he ended the conversation by saying, but hey, Gary, if you really don't feel good about this, if you feel uncomfortable, we could just leave it. And so I think he kind of pulled a Jedi mind trick on me, right? And it just shocked me. And I'm like, no, Abner, we got to change it, right? Because that's what's right. But what struck me was his humility about it. And that gave us even more confidence, right? Is these men are humble. They're not trying to push an agenda. They're not trying to, force anything. So I was taken aback by that too, just how he had this real gracious, humble attitude about this. And it gave me even more confidence in the work that we're doing. But some of the other neat refinements is the word Yahweh, right? I didn't grow up hearing that, but it is unique and special. And it took a little time, but the more you hear it, the more comfortable you get with it. It's extremely, extremely helpful. And it also clearly helps identify who we're talking about, the subject, in passages of Scripture. So I was talking with Martin Iles, who is with Answers in Genesis, a really bright guy, and he was talking about how he was reading through Isaiah 53. And as he's going through that passage, right, it talks about the Lord, it talks about God, and it also talks about Christ, the suffering servant. And he said, sometimes when you read through a passage like that, you're not sure what he is referring to. Is it referring to God or is it referring to Christ? And he said, just the fact of having Yahweh in that passage provide clarity, and it just helped him in reading that scripture, and he found that very helpful. So that was an encouragement. The word slave, right? I think that's someone that people have heard or are familiar with. I mean, most English translations will not use that term. And frankly, it's just because it is a very polarizing word in our culture here, right? I mean, we dealt with slavery in our country. And so for a lot of people, it could be a tough word to just see or read. But if you look at scripture, I mean, if you look at whether it's in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, like doulos, that's the word. It's slave. And what I think is very helpful is using that biblical term. It really is the truth, right? Because if you think about it, we're all slaves. We're either going to be a slave to sin or unrighteousness, or we're going to be a slave to Christ. We're going to be a slave to God. So that word, while it may be polarizing in a cultural context, it provides clarity, precision in how we should understand our relationship with God. So that's super helpful. So I think another improvement with the LSB is consistency. I think the NASB sometimes translated certain words in Hebrew or Greek into the English a little bit differently. So sometimes you might have a couple different English words for the same Greek word or same Hebrew word. And what the translators did was they provided consistency and tried to make one English word associated with, Hebrew or Greek word. And so it connects more passages of scripture together, and in some cases even connects the Old Testament and the New Testament together.